This is Francie Arenson Dickman, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Francie Arenson Dickman.
Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. I'll be talking more about her as the month goes on. Also, thanks to R.J. Panero, his upcoming book, Avenue of Regrets, is an engrossing psychological thriller coming up in November. We're going to be talking about it more this month and talking with R.J. Thanks to him for sponsoring the show. As always, after the show, there's an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Francie Arenson Dickman on the show with me today. Francie has a fantastic new book called Chuckerman Makes a Movie, and I think you guys are really going to love this book. Welcome to the show, Francie.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you. Before we get into talking about your fantastic and funny new book, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I knew this was your first question because I, like some other writers, have cheated.
Nice.
And I'm familiar with your podcast, so I've been thinking about this. And I've been writing since I published my first book in third grade at our learning center.
Nice.
In grade school, I wrote a short story in sixth grade. I wrote my friend's papers in college. I've been writing my whole life. I was a lawyer and a litigator writing briefs. But it took me until I was done with law school and working to realize that I actually wanted to be a writer, an author.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that was an option, actually, until then.
So you, like many, many other writers, just kind of had that thing built in where you were just a storyteller, and some people when they're bored and they want to do something, they go outside and play baseball, or they collect something, and then other people would say, I just want to make up a story just out of nothing, and that's how they entertain themselves. You published that first book in the third grade. Were you that kind of kid where this is just what you do, it just naturally comes out?
Yeah, and it's not so much even the making it up. I started when I was practicing law. I used to sit in my cubicle and write letters to my friends. I obviously did not have enough work to do, about the day in the life of me as this new attorney working and not knowing what I was doing. And they were coming out really funny. And it was then that I started to realize, okay, I could really draw from my own life. And that's basically what I do. And I sort of make characterizations and stories based on what's going on.
Gotcha. So what drew you to law? What was the fascination there?
Well, without blaming my father, I think my dad very much encouraged me to be a lawyer because I did like to write and I do like to argue. So I can see where he would have, put those pieces together to think that this would be a great thing for me. I could make a living. I would be safe. He grew up in the Depression. There was no, that was sort of his. And I didn't disagree. I love politics. I was a poli-sci major in college. So it did all add up. But then when I got to actually working, I loved law school. I lacked some of the major sort of abilities that you need to be a good lawyer that I didn't really realize they're not so obvious at the time, like the ability to report into work regularly and like be accountable. And the details and the bickering, and I didn't have the patience. So I don't dislike the law.
Yeah, the showing up every day, that's a tough one.
It's really hard to do.
So you found yourself in your cubicle just kind of riffing on your own life and your own experiences. What was what kinds of stories would come to you at first?
It was mostly not making fun of myself, but exaggerating the circumstances that I was in. I represented the state against prisoners. There was a lot of comedy, actually, in what I was doing. I was at the bottom of the barrel. So I would go into court and defend the state against somebody who had filed a lawsuit against the state and Marshall Fields for like $63 million. And it lent itself to sort of comedy to me.
Right.
And so that's kind of...
Yeah, I've heard Scott Adams, the guy that created and writes the Dilbert cartoon strips, and he talked about the most mundane things in an office are usually the funniest, and it resonates on a strange level with people because almost everyone has that boss who knows all the buzzwords but really doesn't know anything, or there's the person in the office is just hopeless, and everyone winds up having to do their job for them. That there are these certain caricatures, I think, that kind of pop up in everyone's lives, and if you can find the way to highlight those stories really resonate with people, I've found.
Yes, I mean, like The Office itself, the TV show.
Exactly.
Nothing.
Exactly. So what did you start doing with those stories?
From those stories, I spent a few years. I started to enroll in writing classes, creative writing classes that I would go to after work. And I started to work on a first novel that was very much based on me, a 20-something-year-old attorney who gets involved in this shady law firm. And it was, a comedy and whatever. And I worked on that for a couple years when another idea came to me. And I thought, I'm going to take a break from that because I need a little space. I'm going to just play around with this idea, and I'll go back to that when I'm fresh. And it's been like now probably 15 years, and I've never taken that out of the drawer.
But, a lot of us have those stories, those books in drawers that that should never see the light of day and hopefully never will. But those are the things that, that's when you learn to write a novel, is by sitting down and doing it and getting all the bad stuff, clearing that stuff out of the way and kind of mimicking the mechanics of what we've read for so long until it becomes natural. Those things are super important, I think.
I completely agree. You don't really realize going in what it takes and how long it's going to take to figure it out. And that's the thing about being a writer, is like every day you show up, you still don't really know, what's going to happen and if you're going to be able to figure it out. But that's part of the fun and part of the challenge, and
right.
Part of why I like to do it.
Yeah. When did you decide to leave practicing law?
Probably after like 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started a freelance writing business, so I could.
A freelance writing business
during the day, and then I would get up. Yeah, doing marketing, all sorts of copy instead of law. So if I was my own boss, I could set my own hours, do what I wanted when I wanted. So I would intersperse business writing with creative writing, and that was actually the period of time I wrote that first novel.
Gotcha.
That's how I made it.
How do you get started as a freelance writer doing marketing copy? And did you already have connections that you leveraged, or did you just start putting the word out for work? How do you go from litigating to, okay, I'm a freelance writer now?
Well, people knew I was a writer. I had friends who were, for example, it was like right when the internet was starting, and I had friends who were working at a bank. The bank put them in charge of starting a website. They had no idea what they were doing. They hired me to write the copy.
Gotcha.
And it was one thing led to another. I marketed myself to law firms, so I was doing law firm marketing, the copy for Whole Foods. It was sort of just word of mouth and bits of advertising here and there, but not much.
A lot of happy accidents.
Yeah.
Leading from one to another.
Yeah. It was not as hard as I.
Yeah.
To
when you're
busy.
Right. When you're doing that, and then also working on fiction and those sorts of things at the same time, is it hard to concentrate on writing things for yourself when you're writing things for other people all day?
No, it's really not, because it's two different sides of your brain, really. The business writing is more business and less creative, whereas the creative writing is just yours and no expectations. And I find even now, I write personal essays to get away from writing the novel. It's nice to change it up, to give your brain somewhere else to go.
As a kind of a palate cleanser to move from one thing to another. It's just shifting gears, so to speak, from one thing to another. Yeah,
and it's sometimes, as you know, writing creatively can be frustrating. So it's nice to have the concrete where that frustration doesn't play a part.
Right.
And the concrete can be boring, so it's nice to have the creative to go back to.
Sure. You also started writing some essays and had them published. What was the motivation to do those?
So I started to write these essays to give myself an outlet while I was trying to figure out how to publish or where to publish this book. And that sort of took off. I got a job as a regular contributing essayist at Brainchild magazine, and I did an essay a month for them for over a year, and then was also placing essays in other publications. And that sort of I got a whole sort of gig that I didn't expect to find.
Yeah. What types of things were you writing about?
It's almost the same sort of material as my book. I'm not like the most creative as far as I'm not a sci-fi writer. The story is always based on something connected to me, my life, and my family. So as far as the essays, Brainchild magazine and Motherwell, where I write some of this stuff, it's all revolving around what is going on in my life at the time. So when my kids were younger, it was very much that. Lately, some things have been a little bit, politically oriented. It's just sort of where my head is at a particular time. And I can go through months and have nothing to write about, no ideas. And then all of a sudden something will strike me.
Yeah. When you're doing that sort of writing, which is different than the writing for hire, when you're writing copy for a business, and it's different from writing fiction. It's kind of this in between there, this kind of personal storytelling, if you will. When you sit down to write the next essay for the next, issue or whatever, do you have ideas in mind? What's the creative process? How is it different from when you sit down to write fiction, when you're writing one of these short pieces that's more focused on you and opinion and that sort of thing?
Well, when I was doing it on a regular basis every month, I could look ahead and say, okay, like to May, I could tie it into Mother's Day. I would put my head into whatever I knew where I would be in a month. But events occur all of the time for everybody, whether it's, with my parents or my brother or my husband, my family, things that strike me in the moment that I think to myself, oh, this could be a story. It might only turn out to be a sliver of the story, and I might have to wait like a month or 2 months for like the whole thing to play out. Like I'll sit down to write it and it'll have no ending, or I won't understand where it's going and I'll have to put it aside. And then something will happen a little bit later. And I'll make the connection in my head of one event to another and the theme that is going through my head. And it's a very it's hard to conceptualize the process because it's so in my head. But, for example, like my daughters drove the car through the garage door not that long ago. And that's a no-brainer. Like, that's going to find its way into something.
Oh, yeah.
At some point, It's things like that. My eyes are open all of the time.
Yeah.
For material.
Yeah. And is there, do you find yourself looking at situations and thinking, oh, this is definitely going in a column. But what's the hook for it? A lot of times there's, not a punchline. That's the wrong word. But a lot of times when you're writing short form like that, there's usually a hook at the end or something to kind of all bring it together. Do you find yourself kind of working through what's going to be the hook for this column or essay?
Yes, thank you for articulating what I was trying to say before. I will have things that happen that I will sort of tuck away, file away in my head, and know that they're there for when I'll find the hook. The hook might come up a few months down the road or whatever, but the events and the material is filed away for when things sort of formalize in my head.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I used to write a column for our local newspaper, and I would, it was, just opinion stuff, and that would always, it was the best feeling in the world when you're looking at the same things everybody else is looking at, but all of a sudden something comes to you, some new insight that you had never thought of before. And you're like, oh, I bet nobody else has thought of this either. And then the whole thing just comes together, just bam. And you're like, oh, this is going to be fantastic. There's no better feeling than that. It's
completely the greatest.
Yes.
I was years ago watching a PBS film that a friend sent to me about these twins separated at birth and how their lives, one in the States, one in Norway, sort of played out. And I was struggling with an essay about my girls and all the activities that they have to do and the overscheduling. And the film sort of gave me the hook, tied it all together. The essay went viral. I mean, it's been all over the country. It's been all over the world, actually. And that feeling of being able to articulate what was on my mind, and then to realize that, yeah, I hit something that was going on in everybody else's mind, so many other people's minds, is the best feeling.
Right. Let's talk about Chuckerman. Your new book, Chuckerman Makes a Movie,
yes,
is absolutely fantastic. It's out everywhere now, and this book took me by surprise in so many ways, and I mean that in the best way possible. It's so fun, and it's full of characters that are fresh and new, yet I can relate to on some really strange levels. Tell me about this book. Where did Chuckerman come from, and what's the idea behind this thing?
Chuckerman, came from a conversation with my father about the lack of community anymore. They had moved into a gated community where my kids were staying alone with a babysitter. And we were talking about how when we grew up, we spent every childhood Christmas vacation in my grandparents' apartment building in Florida, surrounded by all of these people. And we didn't really think anything of it, but it was such a thing and such an experience that people just don't have anymore. People don't live like that anymore. Times have changed. And it was really from the sense of just love, and the people in this apartment building, these senior citizens, is all filled with characters. So it's a sense, that whole part is about my childhood and giving homage to a time gone by and to the entertainment value of it. And that's where I started. Chuckerman came in, the narrator, David, is based a little bit on my brother and a little bit on a friend of mine, but my purpose in choosing to narrate a story from a male first-person perspective was a challenge I gave myself to just try and separate myself as much as possible and make it as much as possible fiction, because the first book that is now in the drawer was very much based on myself. So that's where he came from. Gotcha.
The celebrity branding business, because it's kind of so absurd, and that it really sets the stage, for the story. What brought that about in your thinking?
I honestly I don't know. I think at first he was just, a perfume guy. And it morphed along the way. Like, probably it just entertained me at the time. And then my hope with everything is that if it's making me laugh, it's going to make somebody else laugh. It's a knock on the pop culture.
Well, yeah, and it really resonates now, especially in the day of, celebrities with their Instagram and having to do, 6 Instagram lives a day, to protect their brand, and, just kind of this absurd talk that if you were anywhere but celebrity culture, would just be obscene, and it's really a riff on that, and it's really funny.
Well, what's interesting is, like, when I started to write this in 2002 or 3, there was no Instagram. So I think it's actually become probably more farcical and relatable now than it was when I actually came up with it.
So you're the one to set this in motion. It's your fault.
Oh, yeah. It's all me.
You have really three-dimensional characters. That's one thing I really love about this book, is you can just immediately connect with them. Tell me about the Mormon rodeo.
Laurel is probably the only character in the book that is, well, she's not completely made up, but she's the most fictional of all of the characters. I didn't draw on her from anybody I knew. She's an amalgam of a lot of different writing teachers I've had as far as what she preaches in her classes. But her background, that whole thing, I just made up. I was trying to think earlier in the day of where I even got the name Mormon Rodeo. It's been so long since I wrote it, and I really don't remember how that evolved. I do like to put a lot of my effort into naming my characters. Like, I will think for days, and then something will come to me, and that's it. So, I mean, it has to do with the fact that she's Mormon and she wears cowboy boots. But as far as the name, I don't know where I pulled it out of.
So tell us and I'll let you tell what you want to tell, about how much of the plot and stuff you want to give away. But we've got David, and he's he's at a point in his life where he needs to make some decisions. He needs to make some changes. Laurel comes in, and these changes are sort of set in motion. What is David's journey, and where are you taking us as readers in this book?
David's journey is one of going out of his very narrow little comfort zone. He's got a lot of fears. I don't think he's neurotic. He runs a very successful business, but he's got a lot of fears. And he's very constrained by his family and their opinions. And he's been dictated to his whole life by his sisters, his mothers. And it's his story of like just coming out of that sort of getting brave enough to just act on his own. And to realize that his life doesn't have to look a certain way, and it doesn't have to be okay with everybody else around him. It has to be okay with him. And that's I think his journey.
Yeah. And there's an inanimate object that is featured prominently on the cover. Mm-hmm. And when you see this 1977 Cadillac on the cover, there's a certain vibe that you get about this story immediately. Why the 77 Cadillac, and what role does it play in the story?
So the 77 Cadillac is David's object. It's his heirloom. He inherited it from his grandfather. He refuses to let it go. He still drives it. And it's symbolic. It's symbolic of his inability to let go of his childhood. And that forms the centerpiece of both his present day story with Laurel and their relationship, as well as the movie story, the flashback sort of story that he's writing about his past, which it's the centerpiece of that too.
Is there a car like this in your life somewhere?
Funny you ask. Yes, my grandfather had a yellow 77 Cadillac. And he, without giving away too much of the plot, although the book isn't really, you're not going to read it for the plot, I don't think. He, at one point or another, banged it up but good. No one hung on to the car like David did, but that's sort of, he thought he was a really great guy in his 77 Cadillac. It's my memory of it.
Right.
That inspires the car. It's sort of reflective to me of our whole Florida experience. The smell of cigars, the car, that sort of.
Well, and it's a fantastic object to give David and to anchor so much of the story around. Was that an immediate thing that came to you, or did you have to work your way toward finding the Cadillac to play such a role in the book?
You know, so the way this book sort of evolved is I had the Florida story written before the present day story was fully fleshed out. So the object of the Cadillac was really there for the Florida story. And then as I was trying to wrap a present day story around the Florida story, that was the connector for me.
It's amazing when those things kind of fall into place and you're like, this is the object that brings it all together.
Well, that's part of why I love writing.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about for me because so much of it goes on in my head and I don't understand where it all comes from.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like what we talked about earlier with writing essays, that finding that hook, that a similar thing too that happens in a lot of writing, just on a different scale, where maybe you're looking for something to sum up, 500 to 1,000 words that's going to be in a column, or, this object that's going to anchor 80 to 100,000 words in a story. It's a lot of the process is kind of similar.
Mm-hmm. Completely.
Yeah.
It's the pulled out of thin air process. Right.
Exactly. This book is so full of humor and but not slapstick. It's genuinely funny because it's genuinely relatable. But more than just funny, this book really connects on a heart level in several places. Is that something that you're conscious of as you're writing, to not just make this goofy comedy, not that there's not a place for goofy comedy sometimes, but genuinely funny because you genuinely start to care about the characters? Is that something that you're conscious of, or does this just come out of your natural writing style?
In part, it's my natural writing style, but in part, I'm very conscious of it. I had a writing teacher very early on say to me, I had given her something of mine to read, and her remark to me was, like, it can't only be funny. It can't only sing on one level. And that has always sort of stuck in my head and made me conscious of trying to keep it within the realm of funny and yet, as you said, not slapstick. Right. And to mix it with sentimentality and some emotional connection beyond humor.
Yeah. And when you learn to sing multiple notes, that's what really makes a book memorable. When I laughed, I cared about the characters. I feel like I went on a journey with them. That's what makes a great story.
That makes me so happy to hear.
Yeah. Well, the book is out, available now everywhere where, when people are hearing this. It's called Chuckerman Makes a Movie. Francie, I love this book so much, and we're going to send everybody to get a copy of it. There's links to it in the show notes at hankgarner.com for those of you listening. Francie, where can people find you online if they want to dig into more of what you do and maybe follow your other writing and just find out more about you?
The best place to go is franciearensondickman.com.
Excellent. And I will put a link to that in the show notes. Francie, I wish you much success with the book, and thank you for taking time to come on the show today.
And thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. "No way. Ain't gonna happen." But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.